Number 10. Wang Mang in hostile dynastic memory. Some historical erasures are physical. Names are cut away, portraits vanish, inscriptions are broken. Wang Mang is more unsettling because much of his erasure happened through memory itself. That is what makes his case so powerful. He was not simply a failed ruler of the short-lived Qin dynasty. He became a man later history was strongly incentivized to remember in the worst possible way. Once the Han order was restored, Wang Mang could not be allowed to remain a complicated reformer, usurper, and political experimenter. He had to become a warning. That is what gives this case its force. Wang Mang had attempted enormous reforms: currency, land, social order, legitimacy, and restoration of an older, idealized political vision. But when such a project fails, especially amid crisis, rebellion, and dynastic collapse, the victor's memory has every reason to simplify it into moral disaster. The restored order does not want ambiguity. It wants condemnation sharp enough to disinfect the future. So Wang Mang was not merely defeated. He was enclosed inside a hostile narrative that could explain his regime as deviation, arrogance, and catastrophe. What makes this especially dark is that textual civilization can erase as effectively as chisels do. A hostile chronicle does not have to pretend the person never existed. It can do something subtler and often more enduring, preserve them only through a frame that narrows their possible meaning. That is one of the most powerful forms of historical deletion. The person survives, but only as a lesson against themselves. Their motives shrink. Their complexities flatten. Their attempts at statecraft become proof of disorder rather than evidence of a difficult and unstable moment in history. And that matters because Wang Mang's reign was not meaningless in simple terms. He was not a trivial pretender who briefly occupied a throne without consequence. He attempted to reconfigure the political order at a large scale. That scale is exactly why later memory needed him disciplined. A man who intervenes that deeply in the structure of legitimacy cannot be left as an open question if the restored dynasty wants stability. He must be narratively reduced until the future sees not a rival vision of rule, but a moral failure that deserves only rejection. There is also something especially revealing about how dynasties remember usurpers. The usurper is dangerous not only because he ruled, but because he proves that rule can be interrupted and recomposed. Restored power, therefore, has to contain him in memory as tightly as possible. Wang Mang becomes useful as historical poison, a figure whose failure can be used to warn later generations against overreach, false restoration, and illegitimate transformation. Once that happens, memory is no longer describing him. It is using him. That is why Wang Mang belongs on this list. His case shows that erasure does not always mean disappearance. Sometimes it means hostile preservation so complete that the original person can barely be recovered from the moral casing built around them. To later readers, he survives. But he survives inside a structure designed to make him small, dangerous, and permanently discredited. In the end, Wang Mang stands at number 10 because he reveals one of history's coldest powers, the power not merely to defeat a ruler, but to script how posterity is allowed to think about him. He was not erased by silence alone. He was erased by being remembered too narrowly, in exactly the form restored power needed. Number 9, Nikolai Yezhov, removed from Stalinist photographs. Some historical erasures happen through centuries of hostile chronicling. Nikolai Yezhov's erasure is more chilling because it happened with modern speed and modern visual control. That is what makes his case so haunting. Yezhov was not an obscure victim. He had stood close to Stalin, embodied state terror, and occupied one of the most feared positions in the Soviet system. But once he fell, even that proximity became dangerous. The regime did not only arrest and eliminate him. It reached into photographs and made him begin disappearing from the visible record itself. That is what gives the Stalinist image purge its particular force. Photography feels like evidence. People trust it instinctively as a captured moment, a fragment of the real. When power can alter that evidence and redistribute the altered version as truth, erasure becomes especially cold. A statue broken in public still tells you destruction occurred. A photograph retouched to remove a person tries to deny that the connection ever existed in the first place. The person is not merely disgraced, they are visually extracted from reality. What makes Yezhov especially powerful as a case is the cruelty of the contrast. He had helped operate a machinery of repression that itself depended on surveillance, accusation, and fear. Then that machinery turned on him. Once he was no longer useful, the state treated him as a contaminant in memory. The famous images in which he vanished beside Stalin are so haunting because they show how easily intimacy with power becomes evidence against you in a system that cannot tolerate yesterday's allies remaining visible after today's purge. And that is where the deeper darkness enters. Stalinist erasure was not just about embarrassment. It was about retroactive purification. A man could be removed from an image so that the political story around the image became cleaner, safer, and more obedient to the current line. The public was not supposed to see a changing circle of terror. It was supposed to see continuity, inevitability, and a leader standing in uncontaminated command. The vanished figure threatens that illusion simply by having once been there. There is also something uniquely modern about this kind of deletion. Earlier empires struck names from stone. Stalinism struck people from photographs, records, and public narratives with industrial efficiency. That matters because it brings erasure closer to the logic of bureaucracy and media. The goal is not merely symbolic damnation, it is informational management. The past becomes a document under revision. Faces can be cropped away just as names can be removed from lists, speeches, and textbooks. History is edited like a file. That is why Yezhov belongs on this list. His disappearance from images has become iconic precisely because it captures the terrifying smoothness of modern memory control. The state did not need to burn every image publicly. It needed to circulate the corrected version. Once enough people received the altered reality, the original moment became harder to hold on to. Erasure worked not by hiding that editing happened, but by normalizing the edited past as the only past worth seeing. In the end, Nikolai Yezhov stands at number 9 because his case shows what happens when political power gains control not only over bodies and records, but over visual memory itself. He stood beside the center of power. Then he was taken out of the image, as if standing there had never happened. That is one of the most modern and terrifying forms of historical disappearance, not the death of the person, but the official rewriting of the moment in which they still visibly existed. Number 8. Leon Trotsky, erased from Soviet imagery and memory. Some people are killed after losing power. Trotsky was targeted in a colder way as well. The regime tried to kill his place in the revolution. That is what makes his case so dark. He had not been marginal. He was one of the most central architects of the Bolshevik victory, a leading revolutionary intellectual, a key political figure, and the organizer of the Red Army. A man like that cannot simply disappear naturally from history. If he is to be erased, an entire memory system has to be bent around the attempt. That is what gives Trotsky's erasure its force. The Soviet state under Stalin did not merely denounce him as an opponent in the present. It worked to reposition the past so that his role in the revolution, the civil war, and the early Soviet state would seem diminished, corrupted, or secondary to the line that had triumphed. Images changed, textbooks changed, political language changed. The aim was not only to defeat Trotsky politically, it was to make later generations inherit a Soviet origin story in which he no longer stood where he had once undeniably stood. What makes this especially chilling is that Trotsky had been too large to erase cleanly. That forced the regime into a long war against evidence. Speeches had to be reframed. Contributions had to be redistributed. His public visibility had to be replaced by hostile caricature or silence. That is one of the most revealing features of large-scale erasure. The more important the person really was, the more elaborate the system required to make them seem unimportant. Trotsky's centrality became the very reason he had to be pursued so intensely in memory. And because he continued writing, speaking, and criticizing from exile, his erasure acquired a uniquely global dimension. This was not a dead ancient courtier whose surviving voice had vanished. Trotsky kept contesting the story. That made the Soviet campaign against him even more urgent. A living rival who remembers the past differently is dangerous enough. A rival who can publish that memory is intolerable to a regime trying to monopolize revolutionary legitimacy. The struggle was therefore not only over one man's reputation, it was over who owned the meaning of 1917. There is also something especially modern about how the Soviet state handled this. Erasure was not confined to one symbolic act. It operated through photographs, encyclopedias, party histories, propaganda, public ritual, denunciation, and silence. The person was surrounded administratively until the official world gave fewer and fewer signs that he had once mattered at the scale he actually had. That is one of modern power's greatest advantages over older regimes. It can distribute forgetting through institutions faster than memory can defend itself. That is why Trotsky belongs on this list. His case demonstrates that historical erasure often works best not when the target was marginal, but when the target was foundational. The regime had to treat him as contamination precisely because he had once been so deeply woven into the revolutionary fabric. His presence proved that the past was not naturally Stalinist, so the past itself had to be edited until that proof weakened. In the end, Leon Trotsky stands at number 8 because his story reveals one of the most ambitious forms of political deletion in modern history, the attempt to remove not just a person from current power, but a founding revolutionary from the emotional and visual memory of the revolution he helped create. He was not merely exiled, he was pursued backward into history. Number 7. Thomas Becket's attempted destruction under Henry VIII. Some erasures happened to political rivals immediately after their fall. Thomas Becket's case is more unsettling because the attempt to erase him came centuries after his death. That is what makes it so revealing. Becket had already become one of England's most powerful saints. His murder at Canterbury transformed into a martyrdom that drew pilgrims, miracles, devotion, wealth, and a living sacred memory. He was supposed to be untouchable in the historical sense. Yet under Henry VIII, that very power made him dangerous again. A dead archbishop had become politically inconvenient enough to attack long after the body was gone. That is what gives this case its extraordinary chill. Becket was not erased because he had failed to matter. He was targeted because he mattered too much. His shrine represented resistance to royal encroachment in one of the most emotionally durable forms available: sanctity. Every pilgrim who visited Canterbury, every story that elevated his martyrdom, every relic and ritual attached to his cult kept alive a version of English history in which a man could stand against a king and die with heaven apparently on his side. That was precisely the kind of memory Henry VIII's reordering of church and crown could not comfortably tolerate. What makes this especially dark is the formal character of the attack. The regime did not merely neglect Becket's memory and let it fade. It moved against it. His shrine was destroyed, his relics were targeted. His name and cult were attacked as if the state were trying to prosecute a dead man by destroying the infrastructure of remembrance around him. This is one of the purest examples of political power, recognizing that memory itself can function as opposition. The saint had become an institution, and so the institution of sainthood had to be dismantled around him. And because Becket had been dead for so long, the erasure reveals something profound about historical fear. The most threatening enemies are not always living rivals. Sometimes they are stories the present regime cannot control. Becket's martyrdom belonged to a different settlement between sacred and royal authority than the one Henry wanted to establish. As long as that martyrdom remained materially powerful, The past kept arguing with the present. The shrine did not merely honor an old death. It kept proposing limits to kingship. There is also something especially cruel about how physical destruction worked here. A cult lives in movement, object, place, prayer, and ritual repetition. To attack it is to attack memory and all its material supports at once. Pilgrimage routes lose their center, architecture loses its sacred purpose, relics lose their official standing. The dead saint remains famous, but the machinery that made his presence active in the lives of the living is deliberately broken. That is erasure not as silence alone, but as demolition. That is why Thomas Becket belongs on this list. His case shows that power may try to erase a person not because that person is forgotten, but because forgetting has become politically necessary. A king looking to reshape the spiritual and constitutional order of England found that he had to fight a man murdered nearly 400 years earlier. Few examples reveal the endurance of dangerous memory more clearly than that. In the end, the attempted destruction of Thomas Becket under Henry VIII stands at number 7 because it proves that erasure can be aimed backward across centuries when the dead continue to challenge the living. Becket was already gone. His memory still had to be broken. Number 6. Empress Lu's enemies in Han memory politics. Some historical erasures happen through broken statues or vanished portraits. The world around Empress Lu is more unsettling because so much of the erasure happened inside memory politics itself. That is what makes this case so dark. After the death of Emperor Gaozu, Empress Lu became one of the most formidable political figures of the early Han, exercising power in ways later male-centered court history was deeply uncomfortable preserving without hostility. But the men and rival lines destroyed under her dominance were not only removed in life, they were also swallowed into a narrative structure designed to make Lu's rule look monstrous, illegitimate, and unnatural enough that the restoration of male dynastic order would seem morally cleansing. That is what gives the case its force. In early imperial courts, memory was never neutral. It was one of the main tools by which a regime explained why certain deaths, purges, and reversals had been necessary. Under such conditions, the enemies of a ruling woman especially risked double disappearance. They could be eliminated in the immediate political struggle, then preserved afterward only within a moral drama centered on condemning her. Their own complexity, ambitions, fears, and possible claims to legitimacy were flattened by the needs of the story that survived. What makes this especially haunting is that Empress Lu herself was also subjected to hostile memory, which means the whole field around her becomes difficult to recover cleanly. She survives in many accounts as a figure of terrifying excess, vengeance, and disorder. That representation may preserve real brutality, but it also serves a political function. It helps later Han memory explain why the Lu clan had to be broken and why the dynasty had to be restored to a more acceptable pattern of rule. In that process, the people crushed by her power do not re-emerge as full historical individuals. They become props in the moral argument, and that is one of the coldest forms of erasure. A person is not forgotten outright. They are absorbed into someone else's warning tale. Their death becomes useful not as a life to be remembered, but as evidence for the disorder power wants history to condemn. If an imperial rival disappears inside such a frame, later generations may know they existed without ever really meeting them as people. The archive preserves the outcome, but not the person. There is also something especially revealing here about how dynastic legitimacy works. The early Han could not afford to remember factional struggle as open-ended for too long. It needed a retrospective order. It needed certain lines to look rightful, others aberrant, and the violence of correction to feel inevitable. Memory therefore became selective. Enemies destroyed in Lu's orbit were not allowed to remain ambiguous centers of sympathy. They had to belong to a narrative of necessary removal or tragic collateral in a larger restoration of order. That is why this case belongs on the list. It shows that power does not always erase one famous face dramatically. Sometimes it erases whole circles of people by trapping them inside a later moralized court story. The victims vanish into the legitimacy needs of the dynasty that outlived them. What remains is not silence, but a version of remembrance too narrow to count as true survival. In the end, Empress Lu's enemies in Han memory politics stand at number 6 because they reveal a subtler but deeply effective form of deletion. The reduction of real political people into shadow figures inside a narrative written to stabilize the winners. They were removed from power first, then they were removed from complexity. Number 5, Geta and the Roman Damnatio Memoriae. Some regimes want an enemy dead. Rome, at its coldest, wanted the enemy removed from the visible past. Geta's case is one of the clearest and most chilling examples. He was not a minor court figure. He was emperor, co-ruler with his brother Caracalla, and a member of the Severan house standing at the very center of imperial power. Then he was murdered, and after that the machinery of Damnatio Memoriae moved against him. That is what makes his case so powerful. Rome did not simply kill a prince, it tried to tear his presence out of stone, inscription, portrait, and public memory. That effort matters because Geta had been too important to ignore casually. He had appeared in official art, state monuments, coinage, and dynastic representation. He belonged to the visual grammar of Roman continuity. Once Caracalla decided he had to go, that grammar itself became dangerous. Every portrait showing the brothers together, every inscription naming Geta, every dynastic image implying shared legitimacy threatened the new story of sole rule. So the state turned on the record. What makes this especially eerie is the physical evidence that survives. In some images, Geta is not absent cleanly. He is visibly removed. His face is scraped away, his place in inscriptions is chiseled out. The void remains where he was once meant to be. That gives Roman erasure a uniquely brutal honesty. Later regimes might retouch more smoothly. Rome often left scars. You can see where the person was, and you can see where power attacked the trace. The monument becomes both evidence of presence and evidence of violence against presence. And that is why Geta belongs so high on this list. Damnatio Memoriae is never just about forgetting. It is about public discipline. It tells everyone watching that legitimacy now belongs to the survivor, and that even the past must be reorganized to prove it. In Geta's case, the message was especially stark because the empire had so recently displayed him as part of the future. The state had presented him as dynastic continuity, then reversed itself so completely that the same empire had to behave as though his role had been intolerable all along. There is also something especially dark about sibling power in this case. This is not an outsider erased by a stable dynasty. It is one brother using the full symbolic machinery of empire to remove the other from the official world after murder. The family portrait becomes a battleground. Dynastic imagery becomes incriminating evidence. The person most dangerous to your sole legitimacy is the one who stood beside you closely enough to make the old visual record impossible to tolerate. That is why the surviving artifacts feel so haunting. They reveal that erasure often fails in the most revealing way possible. Geta is gone, but the damage announces him. The empty place where a face used to be makes the viewer more aware of him, not less. The attempt to erase becomes part of his afterlife. Rome succeeded in deleting much, but it also preserved the marks of deletion so clearly that later history can still watch the operation at work. In the end, Geta and the Roman Damnatio Memoriae stand at number 5 because they show one of history's purest forms of official erasure, the state trying to revise the visual and textual record so completely that a murdered emperor would seem never to have shared power at all. He was cut out of memory, but the cuts remain. Number 4. Sejanus, after his fall in imperial Rome. Some people are erased because they challenged power openly. Sejanus is more unsettling because he had once seemed almost fused with power itself. That is what makes his fall so dark. As prefect of the Praetorian Guard under Tiberius, Sejanus rose to extraordinary influence inside the machinery of early imperial Rome. He was not merely a courtier whispering at the edge of events. He was a man whose proximity to the emperor, control over access, and influence within the capital made him look almost like a second center of gravity. Then the structure turned. When he fell, Rome did not just punish him. It worked to strip away the possibility that such a man should ever have seemed so central. That is what gives this case its force. Sejanus had become too visible to remove quietly. Honors, statues, alliances, fear, and the sheer public fact of his prominence meant that once he was denounced, the regime had to reverse a whole political atmosphere. A man yesterday treated as indispensable had to become, almost overnight, a traitor, a corrupter, an enemy of the state. That kind of reversal is always dangerous for power, because it exposes how unstable public favor really is. Erasure becomes the mechanism that seals the reversal shut. What makes this especially chilling is the speed and totality of the collapse. Sejanus was executed, his body abused, his family hunted, his allies endangered, and his memory blackened through the same urban and political space where he had once seemed untouchable. Rome did not simply want him dead. It wanted his former greatness to become embarrassing evidence no one could afford to defend. The city had to learn, rapidly, that what it had seen was no longer what it was allowed to say it had seen. And that is one of the darkest features of imperial erasure. A powerful favorite is uniquely threatening after his fall because he proves that the emperor's world had once tolerated, even elevated, the wrong man. The easiest way to contain that embarrassment is not merely punishment, but retrospective purification. The regime must behave as though Sejanus's prominence had always concealed corruption, as though his fall reveals the truth rather than exposing the instability of the court that made him possible. Memory becomes damage control. There is also something especially Roman about the public dimension of this. Sejanus's destruction was not private. It unfolded in a political culture where honor, disgrace, rumor, and exemplarity all mattered intensely. Once condemned, he had to become a warning. The meaning of his life was rewritten so the future would see not a man who nearly became indispensable, but a man whose rise proved the danger of misplaced trust and overmighty ambition. A favorite of the regime was converted into a lesson against favorites. That is why Sejanus belongs on this list. His case shows how power tries to erase not only the person, but the memory of its own dependence on that person. The more central he had been, the more thoroughly his image had to be morally contaminated after the fall. Rome could not allow him to remain a complicated figure of near-sovereign influence. It needed him reduced to a stain. In the end, Sejanus stands at number 4 because he reveals one of history's coldest political truths. When a regime has elevated someone too high, it may later need to destroy not just his body, but the memory that he had once stood so close to the center. He was not only executed, he was made retrospectively intolerable. Number 3. Sejanus and the vanished court favorite. Some historical erasures are famous because the victim was a ruler. Sejanus is more unsettling because he stood beside power without formally being power and then slipped into one of the strangest silences in ancient Egyptian history. That is what makes his case so haunting. He rose under Hatshepsut to extraordinary prominence. Architect, official, royal tutor, builder, trusted insider, and one of the most conspicuous non-royal figures of the court. His name and image appeared with unusual frequency. His career suggested a closeness to the center that should have guaranteed lasting visibility. And yet much of that visibility was later damaged, erased, or allowed to break apart into uncertainty. That is what gives the case its power. Sejanus was never just another official. His monuments, titles, and public presence implied exceptional favor. In a court as symbolically controlled as ancient Egypt's, That kind of prominence meant something. It is precisely because he had risen so high that his later disappearance feels so unsettling. The evidence does not resolve cleanly into one dramatic story. Instead, it leaves behind a pattern of interruption, unfinished tombs, damaged images, ambiguous erasures, and the feeling that someone once very near the heart of power became someone later memory no longer wanted fully visible. What makes this especially eerie is the relationship between Senenmut and Hatshepsut. Because her own memory later suffered intense attacks, the fate of those around her becomes even harder to read. Was Senenmut targeted because he was too closely tied to her regime? Did he fall before the larger assault on Hatshepsut's legacy? Was he simply removed through changing court politics, or was there scandal, fear, and faction behind the silence? The evidence keeps refusing a final answer. That refusal is what makes the erasure darker. We can see the traces of importance and the traces of damage, but not the full sequence that transformed one into the other. And that is one of the most chilling forms of deletion. Later power does not always need to leave behind a clear accusation. It can erase more effectively by allowing uncertainty to do the rest. A favorite vanishes from completion, from continuity, from official future. Tomb projects halt. Representations are damaged. The person becomes harder to narrate. Posterity does not inherit a clean condemnation. It inherits a broken trail. In some ways, that is even colder. It leaves the victim not only removed, but suspended. There is also something uniquely revealing in the unfinished tombs associated with Senenmut. Tombs in ancient Egypt were not casual projects. They were statements about continuity, rank, spiritual future, and the expectation of remembered status. An unfinished or compromised tomb therefore feels like material interruption made visible. The person had planned for permanence. The system denied it. Few things reveal erasure more painfully than an afterlife architecture abandoned before it could finish securing a place in the world of the dead and the memory of the living. That is why Senenmut belongs so high on this list. His case shows that power can attempt erasure not only through total obliteration, but through the destruction of trajectory. A man rises toward permanence, then the line snaps. Later generations are left with monuments that suggest extraordinary favor and damages that suggest deliberate discomfort. Yet the full explanation has been thinned away. In the end, Senenmut stands at number 3 because he represents one of history's most haunting erased figures. Not a king, but a man too close to greatness to survive comfortably once the political world around him changed. He was visible enough to matter, important enough to be dangerous in memory, and then broken just enough that history still cannot fully recover the moment he was pushed toward disappearance. Number 2. Akhenaten. After the Amarna collapse, some historical erasures target rivals who failed. Akhenaten is darker because he was a pharaoh who tried to reorder reality itself. That is what makes his later deletion so unsettling. He did not merely rule Egypt in an ordinary way. He attacked old religious structures, elevated the Aten above the traditional gods, shifted artistic conventions, founded a new capital at Amarna, and tried to redirect the symbolic center of Egyptian life around a transformed vision of kingship and worship. A ruler like that cannot be allowed to remain harmless in memory once the experiment collapses. He is too disruptive. He has to become a mistake the future seals away. That is what gives his case its force. Akhenaten was not erased because he had been unimportant. He was erased because he had mattered too much in the wrong direction. His reign represented rupture, religious, artistic, political, and ideological. Once later rulers sought to restore continuity, the easiest way to stabilize the old order was to make the rupture itself appear illegitimate, temporary, and unworthy of remembrance. His monuments were attacked. His name was omitted or suppressed in king lists. The city he had built lost its centrality. The state moved not only to outlive him, but to narrow his right to have existed as a legitimate pharaoh at all. What makes this especially chilling is that Akhenaten had tried to place himself at the center of divine access so completely that his later erasure became almost cosmological in reverse. He had attempted to reorganize the sacred map of Egypt. Later power responded by reorganizing the historical map of him. This is one of the most profound forms of political erasure, when the target is not only a person, but an alternative order of the world embodied in one person's reign. To delete him is to reassure the future that the universe has returned to its proper form. And that is why the erasure had to be material. Temples, names, cartouches, official memory. These are the places where legitimacy lives in ancient Egypt. A ruler is not only remembered through stories, he is remembered through carved existence. When later regimes attack those carvings, they are not simply venting hatred, they are performing correction. Akhenaten's memory became a site where the restored order could prove that the old gods, the old capital structures, and the older vision of kingship had survived the deviation. There is also something especially haunting about Amarna itself. The city preserves the atmosphere of a ruler who had once imagined permanence in a radically new form. Yet later abandonment and hostility transformed it into the material shell of a failed attempt to rewrite sacred and royal life. That means Akhenaten survives through one of the most tragic archaeological patterns possible. The physical evidence is strong enough to show how bold the project was, and the later damage is strong enough to show how badly history wanted the project reduced. That is why Akhenaten belongs at number 2. His case reveals that power does not only erase individuals out of spite, it erases them when they represent a road the state once closed forever. The man had to be narrowed because his memory kept proving that Egypt had once moved in a radically different direction. The restored order could not comfortably allow that possibility to stand too clearly. In the end, Akhenaten stands at number 2 because he shows what happens when a ruler changes too much and loses. Death was not enough. Political reversal was not enough. The state had to reach into names, monuments, and official succession itself to make his experiment feel like an interruption rather than a chapter. He was not merely overthrown. He was pushed toward historical exile. Number 1. Hatshepsut and the erased Queen-King of Egypt. Some historical erasures are brutal because they remove a dangerous rival. Hatshepsut stands at number 1 because she was something even more threatening to later memory. Undeniable success in a form power did not want normalized. That is what makes her case the strongest on this list. She was not a failed pretender who briefly grasped at rule and collapsed. She reigned effectively, built magnificently, projected royal authority, and inscribed herself into the pharaonic order with all the symbolic seriousness of kingship. That should have secured permanence. Instead, later forces worked to damage her images, erase her names, and weaken her visible place in the royal sequence. That is what gives Hatshepsut's erasure its extraordinary force. A woman ruling as king in ancient Egypt was not merely an unusual biographical detail. It was a problem for any later memory that wanted kingship to look natural, stable, and appropriately inherited through more conventional masculine lines. Hatshepsut had not just occupied power, she had embodied it successfully enough to prove that the system could bend around her. That proof was dangerous. If allowed to stand too clearly, it might make kingship look less fixed than later regimes wished. What makes this especially dark is the selectivity of the attack. Hatshepsut was not obliterated instantly in one clean sweep. The evidence suggests a more deliberate effort to target the parts of her memory that asserted kingly legitimacy most strongly. Statues were defaced or broken. Cartouches were removed. Representations were attacked. Yet the whole pattern feels less like chaotic rage than like controlled historical management. The goal was not simply vengeance. The goal was to make her less available as precedent. And that is why her case belongs at number 1. Erasure becomes most revealing when it is directed not against failure, but against accomplished reality. Hatshepsut's buildings, inscriptions, and royal imagery had already declared a truth the future could not entirely tolerate. She had ruled, and ruled well enough to belong among the great monumental figures of the dynasty. Later memory therefore faced a problem. It could not easily deny that she had existed. It had to make that existence less legible, less central, less dangerous to the preferred shape of kingship. There is also something especially haunting about the survival pattern. Hatshepsut was attacked but not perfectly erased. Her temples remain, her monuments still speak. Her recovery by modern archaeology has become one of history's clearest demonstrations that erasure often fails in the long run, even when it succeeds for centuries. That failure matters because it lets us watch two powers collide across time: the original power that built her memory into stone, and the later power that tried to chisel it back out. And in between those two powers stands the deeper question of motive. Was the erasure driven mainly by Thutmose III's need to stabilize his own line? By discomfort with a female king? By dynastic cleansing? By a larger desire to restore the visual order of succession? The exact blend remains debated, but the moral shape is clear enough. A ruler who had once stood visibly in the place of kingship became someone later authority needed, made less visible. That is why Hatshepsut stands at number 1. Her case captures the darkest essence of historical erasure. Power, trying to delete not merely a body or a name, but a successful fact that threatened the future story authority wanted to tell about itself. She had been too real, too monumental, too effective to leave untouched. So the stone was attacked. In the end, Hatshepsut belongs at the top because her story shows that the most dangerous person to memory may be the one who proves another arrangement of power once worked. She was not erased because she failed. She was erased because she had succeeded in a form later history wanted to make harder to imagine.